Hi class, so like the rest of you, I watched all three videos about how technology and particularly the internet have changed how we relate to each other and with ourselves. And before I watched these videos, I didn't realize just how much it had changed our relationships. I'm fairly young, I'm 25, and so the internet has been a part of my life for many years. Um, and so it's something that has gradually uh, crept up on me and something that I've gradually taken for granted, and now I can't even think of a world without the internet. Although I was born in a world that didn't know much about the internet, and I was born in a world that was barely getting to know the internet. And even when I was in grade school, it was still something that was slow and that was cumbersome to use, and so a lot of people didn't use it either because they didn't have access or they weren't sure how to use it. And now more and more people are having access to the internet, even even in developing nations. More and more people are gaining access to the internet and thus social media, and I think with that, it has been changing how we relate to one another, and how sometimes I think we're using the internet and social media as substitutes for face-to-face interactions that are so important for our mental and physical health. Um, and I know the videos didn't touch much on that, but I think it's important to understand this, that our brains are slowly adjusting to this change, but in the meantime, we're starving for connection with another human being, and we're just not used to having a screen as a mediator. We want direct face-to-face contact with someone else, and that explains a lot of the awkwardness the initial bloggers felt on YouTube. They weren't used to just talking to a screen, and it felt like they were just talking to themselves, and they didn't know who would be listening. I mean, over the years, I think this has gotten easier, especially with the younger generations who are so used to social media and always recording their lives. But even for someone like me, it's still tricky to determine what to share, what not to share, how much is too much for the world to know, and I think we're still trying to adjust to that as a society, because social media as a whole has only been around for about 10 years, Facebook excluded. But the explosion of social media didn't really start until about 10 years ago, and so we're still trying to understand just how it has been changing our lives, and now many of us can't imagine a world without social media or the internet in general. I know I can't, and I think it might be even harder for the younger generations who were born in a world of internet, who don't know a world without internet. And even though most of us older folks remember a world without internet, I think it's important to remind our kids that there was a world without internet, and that it's still very much worthwhile to have face-to-face interactions with their friends, instead of just talking to them on social media all day. if you see your kids spending too much time talking to their friends on the phone, you could suggest that they meet up with that friend or something. At least that's what I would do if I were a parent. And even as educators, I think that we have the power to encourage those the social interactions for the kids, and to use the internet and social media to their advantage, and to make it work for them, not against them. And on that note, I listened to a podcast by Gary Vaynerchuk from his show, the Gary V Experience, Audio Experience, and I listened to one of his latest episodes called "Stop Living for the Short Term," and he was talking about how to use social media to our advantage, especially for those pursuing music, entrepreneurship, or just general exposure. He was talking about how 30 or 40 years ago, if you wanted exposure for your music or your product or whatever, you'd go to the big TV stations or radio stations to get that exposure. And now you go to social media and YouTube to get that exposure. And he's also talking about how traditional venues are having a hard time adjusting to this new reality of influencers and free advertising. And he was talking about how it shouldn't matter as long as those seeking the exposure get the exposure, for whether it's their music, their books, their show, their product. So social media, to Gary, really is the new TV. And if you follow him on social media, he is a master of using social media to gain exposure. He has a YouTube channel, he has podcast show, he is very active on all social media platforms, and I just really like him as a social media / entrepreneur personality. And I think that using web technologies can be really useful in the classroom, to keep up with parents, to keep up and communicate with parents, and to expose kids on how to use the internet responsibly, because we need to teach our kids how to be on the internet safely, and if they don't get that exposure, then we're doing them a huge disservice, because then they'll be lost when they're faced with complicated internet situations. And on that note, I think that social networking applications should not be used until at least high school. Why? Because I don't think that any kid younger than 14 or 15 would be mature enough to handle the realities of social media, where they might get extremely negative feedback that could even spill into cyberbullying, and that's not something that young teenagers would want, especially at such a vulnerable age. And even then, the social media usage should be controlled, because there have been studies out there that rates of depression and suicide have been going up since the explosion of social media, and that's because people have been misusing social media, and they've been using it to compare each other and be negative, and that's something that we need to teach our kids to do better at, to be more positive on social media, to not use social media as a substitute for human interactions, to actually go see their friends instead of just talking to them on Snapchat all day. I think that's important to remind our kids, as parents as well as educators, that we should not use that face-to-face human interaction just because it's more convenient to talk through a screen.